Well, good morning, Journey Church, and all those joining us today in your living room, maybe your car, maybe your garage, wherever you're tuning in today, we welcome you. My name is Ben Opoff, and I'm a teaching pastor here at Journey Church, along with our lead pastor, Chad Nelson. Again, thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday morning. Well, this morning I want us to think about something differently than what we have before. I want us to view something through a different lens than what we're used to looking through. I want us to pull out and to put on an imaginary pair of glasses called present perspective. And I want us to consider something on which we're constantly challenged, but through these present perspective glasses. And what I want us to consider today is the idea of biblical stewardship. Now, often when we hear the word stewardship, we often take it to mean one thing, and that's just money. And more specifically, how do we use that money? Now, while our money is certainly part of biblical stewardship, it is only one part. And the other two parts are just as important that we look at today, perhaps more so now than ever in human history, as we're no doubt living in the end of times as eternity creeps closer and closer. Before we begin today, though, I want us to consider a statement from a man named David Livingstone. David Livingstone was a 19th century doctor, very much a pioneer missionary to remote tribal groups in Africa. And David Livingstone said this: "I place no value on anything that I have or I may possess, except in relation to the kingdom of God. If anything will advance the interests of the kingdom, it shall be given away or kept, only as by giving or keeping it shall most promote the glory of him to whom I owe all my hope in this time or eternity." It really puts things in present perspective. I'll only give away or keep depending on how much it will promote the glory of God to whom I owe my hopes in this time or eternity to come. Well, if you have a Bible near you, I'm going to be reading out of Matthew 25 today. We're going to begin in verse 14. Now, chances are you've no doubt heard this parable before if you're familiar with the New Testament, and that is the parable of the talents. Jesus was very clear in his ministry, in his short time, 3 years on earth. He was very clear about us being good stewards with what we have in this life. Now, in this parable, he draws a comparison between stewardship and invested money. The story is about a certain wealthy man who entrusts part of his wealth to 3 individuals while he's away. Now, the key word here, what I want you to focus on today, is the word entrusts. As we frame our perspective today, this present perspective that I mentioned earlier, I want you to think about the idea of biblical stewardship in all the areas we examine today as being something that God has entrusted you with. Not just given you, but entrusted to you as something God will one day ask for an account as to what you've done with it. So with this in mind, let's begin reading verse 14. "Again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a trip. He called together his servants, and he gave them money to invest for him while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of gold to one, 2 bags of gold to another, and 1 bag of gold to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. And then he left on his trip. The servant who received the 5 bags of gold began immediately to invest the money, and soon doubled it. The servant with 2 bags of gold also went right to work and doubled his money. But the servant who received the 1 bag of gold dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money for safekeeping. After a long time, their master returned from his trip, and he called to give an account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of gold said, 'Sir, you gave me 5 bags of gold to invest, and I have doubled that amount.' The master was full of praise. 'Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together.' Well, next came the servant who had received the 2 bags of gold, with the report, 'Sir, you gave me 2 bags of gold to invest, and I too have doubled the amount.' The master said, 'Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this smaller amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together.' Then the servant with the 1 bag of gold came and said, 'Sir, I know that you are a hard man, harvesting crops that you didn't plant and gathering crops that you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth, and so here it is." But the master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant. You think I'm a hard man, do you? Harvesting crops I didn't plant, gathering crops I didn't cultivate? Well, you should at least have put my money into the bank then, so I could have had some interest. Take the money from this servant and give it to the one with the 10 bags of gold. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who are unfaithful, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Well, I believe this parable shows us three things that God entrusts each one of us with until the day Christ returns or our life here on this earth ends, as I mentioned before. I truly believe that we are in the last days. It's important to note that while each may vary depending on the individual, everyone is given something in all of three of these areas. No one is going to stand before God one day and hear him say, "Well done. I didn't give you anything to do, and you did a great job with it." Everyone has been given at least a certain measurable amount of each of these things to which they will one day be accountable. So what are they? Well, the first is time. Time is the period of your lifetime that you spend here on this earth. Excuse me. If you think about it, it's amazing to think that God has placed you on earth here today for a reason. Of all the different times in history that you could have been born, now and only now was just the right time for you and what God has for you to accomplish right now. Now, I love history. It was part of my major in college. And as I learned more and more about history and all that happened, I would often wonder to myself, what would I do? What would I be if I had lived during a different time period? Like, for example, let's say I was born during World War II, and I was a young man during when Nazi Germany, when Hitler rose to power, during the Holocaust. Would I have organized secret resistance against Hitler? Or what if I lived in the Middle Ages? Would I have been a knight of some kind? Maybe called Sir Benjamin the Brave, or Sir Benjamin the Beautiful? Probably not. Or maybe if I lived in Jesus' time, would I have followed him as he traveled around? Would I have believed him, or would I find myself doubting him like so many others? Well, the fact is, I wasn't born during those times. And it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a happenstance. It wasn't a slower process of evolution. God specifically created me for the here and now. And if you're hearing the sound of my voice today, he created you for this time and place as well. You and I were created for such a time as this. It's really awesome to think about. I mean, think about as God looked down and he looked at the work that he needs to be done right now on planet Earth. He chose you and he chose I to accomplish it at this point of human history. Nobody else. He had plans that were to be accomplished in the centuries before us. And depending on how long he tarries, he'll have plans to be accomplished after we're gone. But right now, we're here specifically for this time and place. You don't have to look much farther than the book of Esther in the Old Testament. Here was Esther, a beautiful Jewish woman taken captive in Babylon and eventually in Persia, growing up in Persia, and a very beautiful young Jewish girl who eventually grows into a beautiful young Jewish woman and becomes queen of all Persia. Well, in Esther 4:14, Mordecai, who happened to be her uncle and also a fellow Jew, realizes he uncovers a genocidal plot to wipe out all the Jews. And Esther becomes the only person that can save them. And she's scared to do it. And he says to her, and who knows, Esther, but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Perhaps this was the whole reason why God allowed you to become queen of this country, was to spare your people. She later does risk her own life to save her people from genocide and is successful. She lived in the moment. She was brave and she seized it. That was certainly part of what God had her to do in her time on earth. So let's look again at the parable of the talents that we just read in Matthew 25. I want you to look at verse 19 specifically. Notice what the master of the house was gone for a long time. Just because he was gone, though, doesn't mean that the servants that were entrusted with his investments knew how long he was going to be gone. He doesn't tell them, I'm going away for 3 months and then I'll be back. I'm going away for a couple years, then I'll be back. He just goes away and says, take care of my stuff while I'm gone. They had no idea when he was coming back. The same applies to you and I. Each of us is going to stand before God one day, and we're going to give an account of what we've done for his kingdom in the time that he gave us. Some of us are going to have 70 years, 80 years, 90 years. Sadly, many don't make it out of their childhood. They may have 7, 8, 9, 10 years. But while no one is guaranteed another year or another day or even their next breath, God has specific plans for them in the time that they are here on this earth. So take a quick personal inventory and ask yourself this. Are you using the time that God has given you to accomplish all that he has for you? Are you reaching all the people that you can with the saving message of Christ? Are you demonstrating his love in a way that makes others want to know him too in the short time they're here on this earth? You know, the old Latin saying, carpe diem, seize the day, is so true. Because after all, life is but a vapor. If you measure our days, it's but a vapor in the length of time, in the length of history, and then it's gone. I remember when I was a young guy in church one morning, the pastor was there and he was speaking. He said, you know, folks, I'm not afraid about dying and whether or not I'm going to go to heaven or not. I know I've put my faith in Jesus Christ. I know when my eyes close for the last time, I know that I'm going to open them in his presence. I'm going to be standing in heaven in front of God. You know what my fear is, he said? My fear is that when I'm standing there before God, that he's going to show me all that he had for me to do that I just never believed or trusted or was faithful to do. And maybe it was out of fear, maybe it was out of pride. Who knows the reason? But I'm afraid I'm going to be able to see all that he had for me to do that I just didn't accomplish. He said, that's my biggest fear in life and in death. Well, Psalm 39:5 says, my life is no longer than the width of my hand. An entire lifetime is just a moment to you. Human existence is but a breath. David's writing that, and boy, did he know it. He saw life come and go. He saw many live. He saw many die during his time. And what does he walk away with? The fact that life, human existence, is but a breath. Now, we don't know how much time we're going to have. All of us, no one knows. Only that we have it now, and we're not guaranteed more. So again, take a minute and ask yourself this. Am I doing all that I can with the time that I've been given? So the second thing that God's given each one of us, he's given us time, but he's also given each of us talents. Now, of the three gifts that God gives each of us, talents are perhaps the most diverse. Notice in the parable that the master of the house does not give each servant the same amount. In fact, there's quite a difference between what he gives the first servant and what he gives the last servant. Let's look again at verse 15. He gave 5 bags of gold to one, 2 bags of gold to another, and 1 bag of gold to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities, and then left on his trip. First of all, I think the most interesting thing to note here is not how much each was given, but why it was given. It was in direct proportion to their abilities. But, as is seen at the end of the story, each is held accountable to the same proportion that they're given. In other words, just as Jesus tells us in Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, much is required. We don't need to look much further than a man like Billy Graham. Much obviously was given to this man in terms of his abilities as a speaker and evangelist. But the reality is, much is also going to be required. When God first called Billy Graham back when he was a young man, it was his choice to accept that call in his life and to make the most of the abilities he had blessed him with. It wasn't like, God decided, oh, you're obedient, so here you go. God had always given him those abilities. It was his decision to walk in those and to use those to accomplish God's plan. Now, today, we look at the Billy Graham ministry, the ministry of Billy Graham, the fruit of his ministry, worldwide, globally. He's probably the most well-known and well-respected evangelist, certainly in the last century, if not of all time. You go to any corner of the globe, his name is synonymous with Christianity and spreading Christianity all over the world. So first, we have to realize that God gives us talents based on what he has for us to accomplish. Clearly, God has not made me. He is not part of his plans for me is not to be dominant on the basketball court or the football field. He just hasn't given me those abilities to play at a level where I can use that as my platform to bring glory to him. In other words, he gives the ability to do things to accomplish his plans. Just like the master gave according to what each servant was capable of. The first received 5 bags of gold, the second only 2 bags of gold, and the last only 1, divided according to their abilities. These differ amongst ourselves as well. I remember when I was a kid and I worked for my dad, he was a bricklayer. Now, I just don't have spatial intelligence. I struggle when it comes to that. Geometry and I never got along. If there was ever a time when geometry and I were dating, we broke up quickly. Just didn't quite understand that. Now, my dad would give me these bricks to go and cut on the saw, and he'd try to draw lines all over them and hold it this way in the saw, hold it that way. I would get them wrong more often than I would get them right. And I remember my dad telling me one time, hey, listen, what I'm asking you to do isn't brain surgery. And I used to think and he would say, if it was, I'm not going to expect you to do it. And half the time it felt like it was brain surgery because I just couldn't get it done. So I guess I've never been called to be a brain surgeon or a bricklayer. My dad would laugh and he'd say, listen, Ben, don't feel bad. I wasn't cut out to be a doctor because, mostly I realized I wasn't good enough at golf, obviously tongue in cheek there. But the reality is, we all have been called to certain things. We've been given talents to accomplish that call and those plans. And it doesn't mean that we all have the same. And it doesn't mean that one's more valuable than the other. It means how faithful are we going to be at doing what he's called us to do, small or great. To whom much is given, much is required. Secondly, we need to realize that we are simply caretakers, not owners of the talents that God has blessed us with. In this story, the caretakers, the servants, were likened to investors of the master's money. And that's exactly how God views us with the talents that he gives us. We need to be evaluating ourselves on a daily basis on how we are doing with his investments. After all, of all the people that have ever lived on this planet throughout all history, remember he's entrusted you and I with unique gifts and talents to accomplish his equally unique plans for us. The question is, are we actively investing those talents to accomplish those plans? Or are we sowing into the lives of others and in so doing collectively building up and accomplishing his kingdom work here on earth? Or are we using these talents simply to build our kingdoms here on earth? Only one of those has eternal significance, and it's his work. Now, imagine calling your stockbroker or whoever handles your investments and wanting to see how they're profiting, what you've given, what you've invested, what kind of a return are you getting? Imagine the response from your stockbroker is, well, I don't really know for sure. I mean, I vaguely remember you giving me those. I really haven't checked them in a while. I mean, I guess they're fine. I'll get around to looking at them here when I've got some time. No way you're good with that. You would yank those investments immediately from whoever's handling those, and you would give it to someone who's going to monitor them closely and give them top priority. You would never stand for that. We also need to understand that complacency is a powerful tool of Satan when it comes to these investments and talents. Look again at the 3 servants. The first 2 avoided it. They avoided complacency. But the last one fell victim to it, and he squandered his gift in fear. His best strategy was to do nothing. If I don't do anything, then I can't gain, but I don't lose. I'm just going to bury it in the ground. Well, the truth here is clear. Jesus, while he expects us to be faithful with the talents and abilities he gives us, he also wants us to improve on them. Jesus leaves no room for confusion about his feelings concerning complacency. Look again in verses 24 through 30. Look what he says here. Then the servant with the 1 bag of gold came and said, Sir, I know you are a hard man, harvesting crops you didn't plant, gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I'd lose your money, so I hid it in the earth, and here it is. But the master replied, You wicked and lazy servant. Neither of those are flattering terms. You think I'm a hard man, do you? Harvesting crops I didn't plant, gathering crops I didn't cultivate? Well, you should at least have put my money into the bank so I could have made some interest on it. Take the money from this servant, give it to the one with the 10 bags of gold. To those who use well what they're given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who are unfaithful, even what little that they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's pretty staggering when you actually think about it. Jesus does not mess around here. He is serious about what he has blessed us with, what he's entrusted to us, and he wants us to bless others as well, and he wants to see a return on what he's entrusted us with. But you might be saying, well, what about me? You know, Ben, I'm never going to be the next Billy Graham. I hate being up in front of people. I hate trying to share anything. I don't have the right words that come out. How can God use me? Well, the Bible is filled with people like that. I think of Moses and Aaron. Moses, he used his influence, but he wasn't a great speaker either, and so Aaron compensated for those speaking difficulties. Not everyone is called to be a speaker or communicator. I'm certainly not. In fact, I'm so ADD. For those that know me, I probably got 100 other thoughts that I'm constantly going through my mind. Just to focus on one thing often is difficult. But God doesn't use us because we think we're good at this or that. It's what he's called us to do. He just wants us to be willing, a vessel that he can work through. God hasn't called each of us to be evangelists, missionaries, and pastors. Some of us are called to be lawyers, doctors, teachers, builders, librarians, you name it. God has given each of us a certain gift with a certain personality that come together to accomplish what he's called us to do here on earth. He's given us each diverse gifts with varying abilities to each of us so that we can further his kingdom on this earth. I remember when I went to Guatemala one time on a missions trip, I was asked to speak at a youth conference there. And I did not have the money to go. I needed to raise my own money to make this happen. And I remember getting a phone call from a guy I knew in high school, a few grades below me. We weren't necessarily close. We knew of each other, but he had saw that I was going to take this trip on Facebook. He called me and he said, I want to give you. He gave me about 80% of what I needed to go on this trip. And he said, God has given me a heart for missions, but I don't feel like he's called me to go at this time, but he has called me to support people who he has called to go. And so I want to support you guys to make his work happen when you go. And I thought, what a great example of being faithful with God, what God had given him at that time of his life. Now, maybe one day God does make a way for him to go. But at this point, he felt like his call was to support those that could. So he's given us time, he's given us talents, and the third thing that he's given us is treasures. Now, by treasures, I mean tangible resources that he's blessed us with to accomplish his will. My friend's gift financially to me was a tangible resource. It was a treasure that God had given him that he blessed us with, myself with, and allowed us to accomplish what God wanted to accomplish in Guatemala at that time. The treasures is where your money and your heart coincide. Now, maybe you've heard a couple of these examples of treasures. Money, and money. So have you heard any of these? Well, you probably have, and there's a reason for that. This is probably perhaps the most difficult part of the three things that he's given to each one of us for us to use for God, because we look at that, the quality of our lives on earth here now are so closely tied to the amount of money or this treasure that we have. Nevertheless, Jesus shows us how important it is to him as he uses the object of money as the very thing that the master leaves his servants in charge of. Now, he could have picked a lot of things that he left with his servants to use, but he chose money. And this was no coincidence, I believe. Jesus did this for a reason. He knew the value of money in society then, and he knew the value of money in society today, and how easily it can cloud our judgment and control our heart, even when we don't see it happening. Luke 16:13, Jesus says this, "No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other." You cannot serve both God and money. He doesn't say money's bad. He just says it shouldn't be your master. You can't serve God and money. You can serve God with money, but you can't serve both God and money. Now look at the example of the third servant in the parable here. Jesus devotes more dialogue to this steward than either of the other two that did it right. And it's not because this guy was the most honorable. Instead, he was of at least investing his master's money and making even a small return on the interest. He gives into fear and complacency, and he buries it in the ground, which made it useless. It starts with our tithes and offerings, folks. Look at what God says in Malachi 3:10. He says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse. There will be enough food, so there will be enough food in my temple. If you do, says the Lord, I will open the windows of heaven for you. I will pour out a blessing so great you won't have enough room to take it in. Try it. Let me prove it to you. It's the only time in the whole Bible that God says, test me in this. Let me prove it to you. I'm telling you, put me first in your finances, and I will open the windows of heaven, pour out a blessing so great you won't have room to take it all in. Now, what was Jesus' reaction to this same attitude of fear and lack of faith? I mean, the people of Israel had this in the Old Testament. So does this servant here. What does he do? He takes away from that servant what little he did have, and he gives it to the one who has the most, but was the most faithful. Look at verse 29. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who are unfaithful, even what little they have will be taken away. Folks, God has work to be done. And I believe that the time is short, very short now, in which that work can be done. No doubt, he has specific plans for you and for me, and he's given us all time, talent, and treasures here on earth to accomplish them. But are we making his work the priority with those time, talents, and treasures? That's the question. Well, I want to close today with this quote by a man named Fred Craddock, which I believe puts what we've talked about today into a perspective that we can not just hear this morning, but take away today and immediately put into action in some way, shape, or form. Listen to this. Fred Craddock said, to give my life for Christ appears glorious. To pour myself out for others, to pay the ultimate price of martyrdom. I'll do it, God. I'm ready, Lord, to go out in a blaze of glory. We often think giving our all to the Lord is like taking a $1,000 bill and laying it on the table. Here's my life, Lord. I'm giving it all. But the reality for most of us is that he sends us to the bank and he has us cash in that $1,000 for quarters. Think about how many quarters that'd be. We go through life pulling out 25 cents here, 50 cents there. We listen to our neighbor's troubles instead of saying, I don't have time, or get lost. We go to a committee meeting. We give a cup of water to a shaky old man in a nursing home. We help somebody. We give somebody food. We help someone across the street. Usually giving our life to Christ isn't glorious. It's done in all those little acts of love, 25 cents at a time. It would be easy to go out in a flash of glory, but how much harder is it to live the Christian life little by little by little over the long haul? Let's pray together as we close today. God, we thank you for today. God, we thank you for the time and treasure and talents that you've given each one of us. Lord, and it isn't happenstance. It's not coincidence, God. You have us here on this time, in this time of history, for a reason, God, for such a time as this. So, Lord, today, I pray that you would do an investigation in each of our hearts. God, show us where we're not fully giving you control and priority in our time, in our talents, or our treasures. And Lord, may your Holy Spirit just work inside us today to be willing to give up that which we're holding back, God, to put our trust in you. Because God, just as in the parable said, you are coming back. We don't know when you're coming back, but we know that you are, God. And we know that that time is short. And we know that you have plans to accomplish. You have a world that you want us to reach now. So, Lord, may we, with renewed focus, use what you've given us today, tomorrow, next week, God, and for the time that we have left in our lives before you return to accomplish those plans, God. We thank you for it. We thank you love us, God. You forgive us, and you've blessed us, and you want us to trust you, God. We thank you for who you are. Pray this in your name, Lord. Amen. I hope you were challenged today with this new perspective on biblical stewardship. I really do want to challenge you this week to really do some inner searching, really evaluate your time, your talent, your treasures, and ask yourself, am I using these fully for what God has called me to do? Well, just one announcement before we're done for today, and that is this. We would love for you to join us on Thursday nights, 7 p.m., for small groups that are going to take place at our outreach building on 36 New Street in downtown Mount Clemens. Again, this will be Thursday nights. The meeting time is 7 p.m., and this is a small group time where we kind of unpack more on what we talked about today to a little bit deeper and more individual level. So we encourage you to be a part of that. Well, until we meet again, church, everyone tuning in today, have an awesome week. God bless you. Go be a world changer. We'll see you later.